My name is Heidi, and I will be the moderator for this discussion. So I imagine that many of you who have decided to join the summit today, as well as join this particular conversation, we don't have to go through the motions of like, oh, like North Koreans are human too, like they also laugh and, go to the bathroom and they sleep. So this is actually a very exciting opportunity to go deeper into what is North Korean society like and what is the socialist structure like. So I'm excited to introduce our speakers. And so this is Haruki, who will be joining us virtually. Haruki, could you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Haruki. I use he or they pronouns. Sorry I have to zoom in because I have COVID. Please take care of yourself, mask up. I'm excited to share my experience. I'm a member of Naruto and I'm also a member of a Chinese Korean organization called Eclipse Rising, and I'm based in Colorado.
And I'm also excited to introduce my comrade Betsy Yoon by me.
Hi, I'm Betsy. I'm also a Naruto member, and I've been participating in our delegation trips for many years, and I'm excited to talk about it with everyone today.
Has anyone in this audience been to a sanctioned country before? Let's see a show of hands. Shout it out. What countries have you been to? All North Korea. Iraq, Cuba. And can I ask one of you folks who did go to one of these sanctioned countries, what kinds of silly or outlandish questions you might have received from people here?
How'd you get in?
How'd you get in? How did you get in? Our speakers who are joining us today have both visited North Korea. Haruki has visited in 2011 as a participant of KEEP. And Betsy has participated in 2009 as well as coordinating 3 years in 2011, 2013, and 2015. So I just wanted to review some of our workshop goals before we get started. So we're going to be sharing stories of these two speakers' visits to the DPRK, but we're also going to be talking about exposure trips in general and their importance for political organizing. Okay, and just to get an overview of what to expect, we're gonna go into what is KEEP. So KEEP is something that was really crucial to the founding of our organization, 노릇돌. So we'll be learning a bit about that, and then we'll go into a conversation with some stories from Haruki and Betsy's delegations, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end. Okay, what is KEEP? So KEEP stands for Korea Education and Exposure Program. Haruki or Betsy, would either of you like to take a stab at explaining what KEEP is?
Sure, I can start and Haruki jump in. KEEP actually predates Naruto and began in 1995 and was the product of efforts from Koreans living in New York and LA to organize trips to South Korea and learn about the democratization movement there and struggles there. And in 2001, so Naruto was formed in 99 out of the people who were organizing those trips. And in 2001, they began trips to the DPRK as well. And in 2005, the KEEP program became wholly run by Naruto. So the last trip we went to Japan once in 2007, called KIJIP. We really like our acronyms. And stands for Koreans in Japan Education and Exposure Program. And the last trip to North Korea was in 2015.
Haruki, do you mind telling me a little bit more about the program? What does it entail? And how do we...
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, here's a little bit of the program. The program is actually, we have a lot of things to do. Instead of rather just going back and forth, we have a whole process of applying and interviewing. initially we were selecting applicants to become delegates to make sure that they are already embedded in the community. So once they come back, they have a place to bring back the lessons to, rather than randomly choosing people, of course. And once you're selected, you have to go through a very intensive pre-study portion where you have to study the history of Korea, more specifically about the DPRK, in the case of the DPRK delegation. And also, before going to the delegation, we're also required to do fundraising, partially for funding our own travel costs, but also to fundraise for medical stuff like vitamins and basic medicines that we often bring to the DPRK. So we raise funds for this medical supplies and purchase these things, and then physically bring these things into the country as we arrive. And then after the whole delegation, we have to come back to our each region and report back publicly, sometimes in a like we rent a venue and invite the whole community and share our lessons together. And in this process, what we emphasize is it's a collective endeavor. So we're trying to shed individualism and try to embody the sense of collectivism. And as a delegation, we are trying to show up as unified and as militant and as disciplined as possible. So in some of these photos, you might see us in a relatively formal outfits, because we actually have dress codes so that we're not just randomly showing up with revealing too much skin, right? We're representing a whole community of Koreans in Japan, so we want to show up as strongly and good looking as possible. And that's the same for the other side. When the folks who welcome us are also professionally dressed, so we want to match the energy and respect as much as possible. So it's a very full-on program. It's not just a tourism, it's a political project of exposing diasporic Koreans who are usually prevented from learning about our own homeland history or anything about our homeland, and truly sort of developing our sense of connection to our homeland. So we have this collectivist culture in our program together.
Thank you, Haruki. It sounds like it's a very intentional and intensive process, not only leading up to the trip, but also coming back from it. I was wondering if one of you could tell me more about the itinerary. What are some places that you visited? Commonly is asked is, was it a guided trip? Did it have a fixed itinerary? This is kind of commonly assumed when traveling to the DPRK.
Yeah, the trip to the DPRK is usually about 10 days. We fly into China and do an orientation where we get to know each other and like establish norms and guidelines, and then we travel collectively to the DPRK. Sites that we usually see are things like factories, we go to schools, we go to farms, we go to museums. We go to this place called the Children's Palace, which is like an after-school program for kids where they go and are engaged in an activity of their choosing, whether it's, it ranged from like, doing traditional Korean instruments to computer programming, to swimming, to ballet. So when we go, we get to see like all these very talented children studying something that they enjoy. We go to places that memorialize the ongoing conflict and relate to the ongoing conflict, such as the DMZ, the Shincheon Massacre Museum, sometimes the Fatherland Liberation War Museum. And in constructing the itinerary, we work with the Overseas Committee, the Overseas Koreans Committee of the DPRK. So they have a committee of the government that is tasked with working directly with Koreans overseas. And so one thing, the itinerary development really points to the value of developing long relationships over multiple trips and multiple years. Because the first trip in 2001, the people who organized the trip didn't quite know like what could be requested, what kind of sites should we go look at? And so there was this sort of boilerplate itinerary of very typical sites that they take everyone to. And at some point around 2004, I believe, I'm not sure of the exact date, but it was like after a couple trips, the coordinator for that year was like, why do we always go to the same places? I've seen this thing before, I don't want to go again. And other people organizing the trip were like, no, it's we don't want to like rock the boat. Let's just like keep doing what we can and, you know, enjoy the trip and learn what we can out of it. And she said, no. Some of you might know Julian and know that that's her personality. She was like, no, I'm going to make a very long 10-page request paper that I'm sending to the Overseas Committee detailing what other places we want to go to. We saw the Pyongyang hospital. We want to see a regional hospital this time. Or we saw, you know, I don't remember all the details, but it was sort of like, let's sort of look into the variety of things we can understand rather than having a one-dimensional visit each time. And she just sent it off and was like, if they deny it, they deny it. At least they have it. And she told us that when they landed in the airport, everyone in the Overseas Committee who had met them at the airport, their guides and stuff, they all had the itinerary printed out. And they were like, thank you so much. We don't know where you guys want to go either, so we just put some stuff on the list, but because you told us what you wanted to see, it really helped us construct a trip that is valuable for both of us. And so ever since then, as we do the trip, we talk to the participants who are in that particular delegation and see where they want to go and construct the trip around the participants' desires. So for example, in 2011, we had an acupuncturist, so we went to an Eastern medicine facility and saw a facility there. I'm a librarian, and we visited the Grand People Study Hall, which is their central library. And so the trip is constructed around the participants and is therefore like more valuable. And I think the lesson there is that don't just assume that like because you know, the stereotypical view is that they're rigid and not flexible, and there's a guided trip and you can only see certain things. The lesson there is that don't assume that and engage with them, you know, and even when you're a progressive or on the left, it can be hard to break out of your preconceived notions even when you think you are. And I think this particular incident is a demonstration of how that plays out in real concrete ways.
Thank you, Betsy. That's such a meaningful lesson. Haruki, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the guide team. Who are you traveling with while you're in the DPRK?
Yeah, so you might hear stories from a bunch of different people going into the DPRK, including tourists as well as humanitarian workers. They actually are greeted by different government branches. And when we go to the DPRK, we work with Overseas Korean Committee. So we actually have this explicit, diasporic national connections as we work together. So we have a very different relationship from just tourists going into the country. And when we are greeted at the airport, we usually have the representative of this committee, and we have interpreters, depending on the size of the delegation, multiple interpreters who are with us the entire time, translating and interpreting everything that we're trying to communicate with each other. That's such an intense job and physically really taxing too. They also provide us with a bus and a bus driver with whom we also get close to during the trip. And because our delegation tends to be younger, like in 20s, 30s, so in North Korea, they have the youth league, and the youth league representative often also accompany us with our whole trip as well. So it's not just random people coming with us, but very specifically chosen to represent their side. So we're trying to build a relationship throughout this trip with these people. When we eat together, for instance, on the bus ride, we sing together and talk about each other's families and lives. So it's a full-on relationship building. And we may not necessarily talk to random people on the street, but with these specific people who are accompanying with us, we actually build a lot of strong relationships over almost 2 weeks, actually.
Thank you, Haruki. And Betsy, I really love this story of how, this communication with the Overseas Korean Committee, it's not just a unidirectional thing where you're receiving an itinerary. We as like overseas Koreans are also able to be in communication and kind of transform, like they are changed and we are changed by these interactions. I was wondering, Haruki, if you could tell the story of the LGBT terminology.
Every delegation, we actually often have the same person coming with us, like the same interpreter coming with us, some same committee rep. And even if the person who were with us the previous delegation may not be with us the next time, but they might stop by at a dinner and just say hi. So we actually have this reiteration of relationship building. And in 2011, when I went, me and my comrade Hyun were the two queer identifying delegates. And throughout the trip, we were like, how do we sort of think about what it means to be queer in the space in the DPRK? There's nothing explicitly gay about this space, but we're trying to have moments of building relationships. And at the end of our trip, we decided to gift a list of LGBT terms to our interpreters, just saying what this LGBT stands for, right? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And we just gifted the terminology and the definition to them. And that was 2011. 2 years later, the following delegation went again, and the following delegation were using, instead of LGBT, they were saying LGBTQ. So the interpreter were like, what is this Q stand for? We did not hear about this Q before. What happened in the past 2 years, right? So so there's this iteration of relationship building that we were trying to make together. And there are some moments of like things that happen in the US sort of impact the way we engage with the people in the DPRK also. So it's like they may not necessarily be aware of these things about LGBTQ stuff, but our attitude is like we are queer and we're not going anywhere. So to some extent, they have to get used to us also, right? It has to be a mutual trust building process. So that's a very, I heard interesting experience story about the following delegation after my delegation, sort of having this another moment of like, wait, what happened, and getting on the same page.
Yeah, if I may add to those stories, the previous year's delegation, 2009, we usually have queer people on our trip, and we were at the site of a national celebration for 727, which is this time period, but they celebrate it by dancing in the square in very colorful outfits, and usually some of us, we get to go jump in and dance with them. And one of our members, as they were asking us if we wanted to go in, they asked her, do you want to be paired with a man or a woman? So they were, even though it hadn't been fully like discussed, there was some like awareness and recognition. And then to add on to the LGBTQ, so the person that they gave it to was our translator who had been with us for several years. And all the translators, they're part of a national translation team, so they agree on how to translate certain terms. So that they translate consistently. So she had brought back the LGBT to the translation committee, and they had incorporated it. And when the next year's delegation, 2013, was trying to explain the queer part, she was initially confused because she's like, isn't it incorporated in the other terms? What's the need for this last term? She was just trying to understand. And as they were explaining to her about the term and like reclaiming and all that, she was like, oh, being queer means being a revolutionary in the sexual sphere. And she sort of like, So I think like, it really points to the value of returning and going back and building relationships, not just going once, and the value of having an organization do that, because even though you may not individually be able to go multiple times, you are still building within this existing tradition. And we'll talk later, but which is why it's really tragic that the travel ban exists, and we, have told a lot of these stories all again, and would like to make new stories.
Thank you both. I want to transition us a little bit, and we've kind of already gotten started, but let's talk about some more stories from the delegations. My first question is, what was the culture and daily life like? Was there anything that surprised you?
In terms of daily life, we would witness everyday fun things like people having picnics at the parks or riverbanks, just out in the nature. In Pyongyang, there's also amusement park. You might have heard about the recent news about the beach resort being developed. In North Korea, in the DPRK, everybody is encouraged to master at least one sport and at least one musical instrument, which really emphasizes that everyday fun, right? And it's a very collectivistic culture. So compared to the US leisure time, where nowadays our leisure is so glued to our smartphones and it's so individualized, and even our leisure time is creating value on the platform economy and under attention economy. So if you think about the contrast between how people have fun in daily lives between the US context and the DPRK context, I feel like the everyday fun in the DPRK is so much more collectivistic and wholesome and community based. And the fact that the people are encouraged to be healthy and mastering sports and also good at musical instrument, as well as any artistic things and creative things, it really points to the value that the DPRK places in holistic development of the human being, which in the US is pretty much only encouraged in like very elite liberal arts colleges, right? Other than all the rest of us who are the workers only are allowed to go to the university, if we are allowed to at all, for occupational training rather than developing ourselves more fully in the context. So the educational value and the everyday fun sort of reflects in this, I feel like in this context of how people sort of see their life and the value of their life. And these kinds of values of social life sort of gets reflected also in the sense of belonging and connection that people always have, right? In the US, in capitalist culture, we often experience alienation from our labor in this very Marxist theoretical sense, where we don't really enjoy work in the capitalist society, and we're not necessarily able to see the fruit of our labor at the end, and we're also alienated from each other as workers and co-workers. But that's the entirely different context in socialist countries. And people really, don't necessarily think about this public versus private distinction that we often think about in the US, right? In the US, it's all about owning private ownership, like your own house. This distinction between the public and private is very much mediated and kind of blurred in this in-between phase of the community in the society together. So we've heard about the episodes, these anecdotes of people just, they're not necessarily required or right tasked to do this, but they take care of their own streets and their own towns, and they pick up trash as they see it on the street. They pull out weeds as they see it. They're not because they're ordered to do, but they because they feel a sense of belonging to the space and their own land, and they want to take care of the land together. So they have a strong sense of the community, and that really shapes the outlook of the society together. So that's something that I'm always thinking about when I think about the daily life and how people relate to each other and to the land that they live on.
This sense of collectivity is also very institutionalized. So, for example, there are baby homes and childcare homes where working parents can send their children, but also we visited factories that had attached, childcare facilities so that, parents could bring their child with them to work, drop them off at the daycare and go to work. And so this sort of, you're not sitting here struggling trying to figure out childcare so you can earn enough money to feed yourself. It's embedded within the structure of the system to facilitate things. And the same with the children's home that I told you about, where children go for after-school care. After-school programs here are, expensive. Daycare here is so expensive, and there it's just something people do, and it's facilitated on a structural level, not on an individual, like based on, I'm a nice person, so I'm gonna have a daycare to my facility kind of thing.
Oh, thank you so much. This kind of question of like, what is the relationship that the individual has with their labor and how labor is organized in the society is so meaningful. I was wondering if you two could talk a little bit more about the differences in work life that you saw.
We visited this factory one year, and they were telling us about, has anyone here heard of CNC? Yeah. So it's some degree of like automation, right? And they had implemented it in their factory, and they actually have a song called CNC, which is one of Haruki's favorite songs. Sort of like praising CNC as being part of the progress of the revolution. And so we were in this factory, and they were talking about how they implemented the CNC stuff, and they were so proud of it, and they were showing us their machines. And meanwhile, all of us were like, oh no, what happened to the workers whose jobs this automation replaced? That was like our first thought. And there was a period of confusion because they were like, what do you mean, what happened to the workers? And I'm sorry, I'll be saying the story again tomorrow on my panel, but they were like, what do you mean? What happens to the workers? They're still working, they're doing other things. Like there was a miscommunication because our question was so bizarre to them. And similarly, like we were in the van driving by, this apartment complex that was being demolished and rebuilt and modernized. And one of the people in the bus was like, what happens to the people who lived there before? And they were like, what do you mean, what happens? They moved back in when we, and so like, we're used to a society that's so alienating and so horrible to people that any sort of progress and mechanization is viewed as antagonistic to human beings, and sort of any sort of improvement and modernization is seen as antagonistic. But the value of going to a society that's not organized around capital is to see that it doesn't have to be this way, no matter how naturalized they want us to think that this way of living is.
Yeah, one of the main theoretical understanding to think about the difference between capitalism and socialism, communism is who owns factories and houses and farmlands, right? On who owns the means of production. And in socialist societies, workers own the factories instead of bosses owning the factories, right? So that level of material relationship to the process of production really reshapes the human relationships at the workplace too. So instead of seeing your bosses as bosses in the sense that we're so used to in capitalist societies, there's leaders, and there might be leaders, but they have the same level of voice. And if the leaders are not functioning well, they can be replaced. But the same factory is owned by the workers together. And in that sense, they're not just co-workers in the way that we think of our co-workers, but they're really comrades working together to build the entire country together. So one of the delegations, they asked this question when they were meeting with, I forgot which factory precisely it was, but they raised this question of what happens if your coworker doesn't want to show up one day. And of course they didn't understand the question immediately, and they did a back and forth. They did a little more probing and contextualizing the question. So the question was like, what happens, right, if you don't feel motivated to work and you just don't feel good about themselves? And the DPRK folks, their workers were like, we would just, go to their homes, bring food if they're just checking on them, if they're doing okay. and they wouldn't just give up on their coworkers if they don't show up to the workplace, not because they're not just coworkers, but they're truly comrades. Their lives are interdependent and intertwined with each other's lives. And if your comrade is not doing well, that means collectively you're not also doing well enough. So they take care of each other together, and they follow through their commitment to each other, even at the workplace, right? The workplace is the site of revolutionary work, right? The revolution doesn't happen somewhere in the abstract. It happens concretely when we're working together. So I think that sense of owning the process of working together and feeling a sense of belonging to each other as comrades doing the revolutionary work, I feel like really characterizes the work life that they have cultivated over these decades in the DPRK. So I'm really inspired by that sort of relationships that they have with each other. It's totally different from our capitalist way of sort of seeing each other at the work.
Yeah, and if I can interject another story, I think these different social relations are really show up in very like small ways that you just sort of perceive and see like in everyday interactions. So, as Haruki mentioned, we're accompanied by a bus driver, we're accompanied by a youth league rep, overseas committee rep, translator. The youth league rep and the overseas committee rep are obviously like part of the government, and so coming from the U.S., you feel an implicit sense of like distinction or distance between maybe a bus driver and a government, a government worker, but we really saw through their interactions how, well, they all called each other comrade. They didn't call each other, like name like honorifics in Korean. The bus driver said comrade, the translator said comrade. And there was one time where we were driving and there was some sort of like blockage in the road, and the bus driver said to the youth league guide, "Hey, go take care of that." And he said, "Oh yes," and went to take care of it. And it's a small moment, but to me it really exemplified the reality of the nature of the relationships as being sort of not so hierarchical and alienated as we would necessarily see here. It was very natural the way they all engaged with each other. And so people like to talk about how the guides are like an oppressive component and they're there to keep an eye on you and stuff like that. But you really gain a lot of insight when you see how they relate to each other. And like all you have to do is just switch your perspective a little bit from being like they're here to spy on us versus like what can I learn from like how these people interact.
Thank you so much. I think you both touched on this idea of alienation and like alienation from labor. And I think part of that is kind of distinguishing a workforce between its skilled laborers and its unskilled laborers. Can you tell me a little bit about how skill is developed amongst workers?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the education aspect too, right? Education for the sake of, once again, holistic development, but also building the country all from the bottom up. And as I mentioned, everybody's encouraged to master sport and music, and the level of resources put into educating the entire nation from the very young early age is very strong. And you might have heard somewhere, but right after the North DPRK was founded, one of the things that the country immediately focused on was increasing the literacy rates. And since then, the educating of the people and increasing and maintaining the literacy rates has been one of the top priorities in the country. And to the extent that you might have also seen the symbol logo of the Workers' Party of Korea, right? In communism, the regular symbol is the hammer and sickle, but in the DPRK, there's one more element added to it, which is the pen, which symbolizes the office workers and the educated people and the role of the knowledge workers in building the society together, along with the farmers and peasants, as well as factory and industrial workers. So the entire country sort of focuses on education. And any child who's seen at excellent at any kinds of stuff, from arts to sports to computers to anything, right? Education is entirely free, all the way to the higher education. They are very much encouraged to pursue their own interests in elevating their own knowledge and pursuing their careers, right? People do choose their careers in North Korea, and the level of emphasis they place on education is, to me, I'm an educator, so it's such an admirable thing to witness. And there's also, in addition to the formal education system, they also encourage continuing education too. And Betsy can talk a little bit more about this Grand People's Study Hall, which is the big building in the very center of Pyongyang as a city. And you might have seen the military marches in some of the news clips where the DPRK leaders are standing on top of this balcony and looking down at the military parades. And that building where the leader's standing on is not like a government office, it's a library. It's a huge castle of a central library, nationally owned. And they intentionally built the library, the People's Study Hall, in the geographical center of the city to symbolize the significance of continuing to study together and educating each other and ourselves. So even at the level of urban planning of Pyongyang, education is very central to the value of the DPRK society.
Yeah, and in addition to like the Grand People's Study Hall is like a grand example of how they sort of implement this, but one example I really like of how they do it on a very small scale is, as we said earlier, DPRK is a sanctioned country and they have limited access to a lot of resources. And paper, for example, they don't just have piles of notebooks lying around. Paper is like a valued commodity, and a lot of times it's like, compared to the notebooks that we all have here, it's like very lightweight paper. This would be, anyway, getting off track. But they're, so they don't necessarily have the resources to like produce. They do produce newspapers, and there's actually some examples of newspapers that I've got on the table back there. But they, in order to make sure that everyone in the country has access to the news and is an informed populace, they have these little kiosks on their subway stations and in other public areas where they have pages of that day's newspaper sort of like laid out, and people, while you're waiting for your train, you can sort of look at the news without needing to purchase a newspaper or anything like that. And to me, that's an example of like a very small innovation that they've implemented to try to like maximize access to information and impact. And I think that's like, and Haruki mentioned the literacy efforts. Right after the revolution. And they tried a lot of really creative ways to get literacy. They weren't content with good enough, but they made sure they like posted signs above the washing stations. They would send people to people's homes and be like, why aren't you going to these classes? And I think we still see that spirit today in things like the newspaper kiosks and the Grand People's Study Hall of like, in the context of the limited resources that we have, how can we still make sure that we have an informed and engaged citizenry who can talk about issues? And also being around the kiosk is a way of collectively reading the news, because you're standing there with other people looking at the same thing, and it's not necessarily an isolating act. So I think that really symbolizes how the sense of education, engagement, and involvement is built in on the both large and small scale.
Thank you so much, you two. We do have 10 more minutes for this section, so I want to move us along. Could you talk a little bit about the development of the country that you saw, kind of comparing, Pyongyang as the capital versus the countryside?
So whenever we think about development, and you might have heard this term underdevelopment, right? We have to be careful about what's causing the so-called delay in development, which often we think about underdevelopment. And if we don't isolate the context of the country from the larger context of the entire world where imperialism is dominating the distribution of resources. Underdevelopment is actually an intentional tactic of colonialism and imperialism to steal resources out of a colonized or subjugated nation. So I encourage you as an educator to think about underdevelopment as not just a natural thing, that natural delay that happens in this process of development, but there's a concrete factors, external often factors that contributes to the stealing of resources that results ultimately in underdevelopment. But with that in mind, thinking about the development in the city, for instance, in capital, there's a lot of high-rise buildings. You might have seen some footages or photos of Pyongyang. There's, as you see in some of these photos, people are just walking about. I think there are increasingly more and more cars also, but they have a lot of public transit system, both underground subway system as well as above ground trolleys, as well as buses and taxis. And one thing I was struck when I was there was at night, right? You probably have seen the satellite image of the DPRK being almost completely dark. And in Pyongyang, there's some street lights and light posts, but it's still very much dark. But despite the darkness of the city at night, there's still as many as you see on these photos, people walking about, because especially it was in the summertime, so it was very nice to be walking outside also. So to me, that indicates, right, even if it's dark in this big city at night, people feel safe enough to be just walking around. It's such a stark difference from the context of nighttime cities in the US context. So that's something that I'm often thinking about. And urban development continues, not just these high-rise buildings for the sake of anything, but in the US or capitalist societies, right, all these high-rise buildings are often office spaces, but in Pyongyang, a lot of these tall buildings are actually housing units, like apartment buildings. And actually, in the past 4 or 5 years or so, between 2021 to 2025, they have built 50,000 housing units in Pyongyang to match the demand for housing, right? As people get married and build new families, they need new housing units rather than staying at their parents' houses. And the population is growing, so they have to meet the demands for housing units. And they've been building so many, right? Tens of thousands of housing units, which once again, compared to the US context, we build houses, but how many? And it's for profit, not just actually trying to house people. So that's something that I'm often thinking about in terms of the urban development of the of Pyongyang.
Thank you, Haruki. And I want to sort of contribute to this topic by reflecting on the visibility of changes that you can see when you go multiple times. So as I mentioned, I was there from 2009, 2011, 2013, 2015, and this scale and speed of changes that occurred was really so interesting to see, especially when you can contrast this to the typical narrative of the DPRK as like a static, unchanging place that's very rigid. So, for example, in my first time there, we actually flew into a temporary airport that they had built because they were in the middle of constructing their main airport. And then when I visited I don't remember if it was the next trip or the trip after that, but we got to, see the completed airport. We flew into the completed airport when we came on subsequent trips. Another thing was when we went in 2009, we didn't really see any cell phones, but by 2015, our guides were on the phone all the time, like being like, we're running 15 minutes late, like, sorry about that, etc. Or like, we can't visit this place anymore. So we had our overseas committee, in 2013, our overseas committee guide was called EO Money, which sort of translates to Omoni and want to read or something like that. But anyway, we call her Pali Pali Omani. Pali Pali means fast. So like, cause she was always speeding around and she was like in her 70s and she was on her phone all the time, just speeding from place to place. Another big sign of change was, are you guys familiar with the traffic controllers in North Korea? There's a lot of media showing like these people standing in the middle of intersections, directing traffic, and often it's the pictures like, the news coverage I've seen has been like, oh, look at these robotic people like standing in the middle, like guiding traffic really quickly. But I thought they were really interesting as a innovative adaptation to the lack of electricity that North Korea experiences due to sanctions, meaning that traffic lights were not safe because electricity, in the times that I've been there, the electricity would go out at random times, and so it was not reliable. And so I was really interested in this role. And then when I came back again, I don't remember the exact year, but in a subsequent year, when I came back, the translator who had been with us on previous trips, on the bus in, leans over to me and is like, do you notice anything? And I was like, oh, what happened to all the traffic controllers? And she was like, oh, they phased them out because our electricity supply is better. And so we've introduced like more traffic lights and stuff like that. And so that's one example. Another example is that fashion changes. And Haruki mentioned that we had dress codes because we want to be respectful of their cultural norms and stuff. And then when we flew in 2015, the stewardesses were wearing stuff that was out of our dress code. I was like, oh, this, if we saw a participant wearing this, we would have been like, that's too immodest. You need to wear like a shirt that covers up a little more. And here we were in the airplane with the stewardesses wearing these like low-cut shirts, and I was like, oh, their fashion is changing as well. So like, and again, like we said at the beginning, this is not good. We don't want this to be a presentation about like, oh, look, they're people too. But like, just to reiterate, the narrative of them as a static place is so strong that I just feel like it's important to reiterate the fact that they are a dynamic society, and that despite the fact that they're suffering under sanctions, they are innovating in specific ways to survive and persist against US imperialism.
So in the DPRK, 80% of the population resides in rural areas. We might see and hear so much about the capital city, Pyongyang, but most of the people actually live in the rural areas. And on top of that, right, most of the northern half of the Korean peninsula is a mountainous region with very little arable land, right? Land that is usable for agriculture. So already between north and south, agricultural wise, the northern side is at disadvantage. And that's part of the reason why it makes sense for the peninsula to be reunified in terms of agriculture production and sustainable development. And in the countryside, the development is very much delayed, once again, for reasons such as sanctions and natural disasters. And as you see in one of the photos here, people are still using ox carts. As a result of sanctions, they're not allowed to import tractors and other kinds of agricultural equipment, right? Sanctions even prohibits the imports of like paper clips and syringes and medical equipment too. So all the things that you might have heard about sanctions targeting the elite ruling class is a complete lie. Every single day, everyday people in the DPRK are impacted by the sanctions, not allowing the import of these life-sustaining equipment and tools. But in that context, they've been focusing a lot more on the regional and rural development. And recently, the DPRK government initiated and inaugurated this plan called 20 by 10 regional plan, which means in the next 10 years, they've identified 20 places or 20 counties throughout the country to focus on production of constructing production bases, so including factories and agricultural bases. And that means in the next 10 years, they will have 200 of these production bases throughout the country. Now, I actually have a map here. It's rare to see North Korea map at all, but here's the map of the production bases that they're focusing on. And the black dots are the ones that have already been completed, and the red ones are under construction this year, actually. So they're really trying to focus on mitigating the gap between the urban development versus rural development because they're acutely aware that the livelihood and the living standards in the countryside are very much delayed and backwards and low. So they're focusing on this. And part of this plan is not only just building factories and greenhouse farms and things that help people survive on procuring food, but also including building hospitals in these regions, as well as producing backpacks and school uniforms that allow children to attend school. So once again, it's a very holistic approach to regional development that includes so many different aspects of development that actually enables the masses, the people, the ordinary everyday people to live their lives and raise the standard of living. So I just wanted to quickly introduce that massive project that's happening too.
Okay, so just really quickly, I just want to point out that Haruki's thing really demonstrates how they're not underdeveloping their rural areas. They want to develop the whole country, you know. Here, there are areas that are being used and exploited in order to support other parts of the country. And instead in North Korea, they are trying to bring everyone up to the same standard of living. And also, I wanted to highlight that the oxen is not because they don't have the tractors. They have the tractors. They imported a lot of tractors during the 70s from the Soviet Union, but they can't have the fuel to run the tractors. So that's even worse, in my opinion, because they have these mechanisms to engage in development, but they're being strangled from being able to do it and have to rely on things like oxen when they do have the facilities to engage in more high level development.
All right, the underdevelopment, if anything, is rooted in U.S. actions.
Yeah.
For my final question, in what ways does KEEP develop political consciousness in the wider community, not just the delegates who get to attend? What kind of knowledge does people-to-people diplomacy enable?
I thought about this in terms of diplomacy. When we hear about diplomacy, we often think of state officials, but diplomacy often happens at the community grassroots level. And that's actually way more important than high level official diplomacy, right? So in these delegation tours and exposure trips, we are there to learn from them, but they're also able to learn from us. So it's not just us going there to exploit data and knowledge, but we're actually trying to build mutual knowledge and trust together. And like I mentioned earlier, we especially right us in the diaspora, I'm from the community of Koreans in Japan, we're systematically deprived of our access to the knowledges that relate to our homeland about anything, right? About basic Korean history, from anything that happened in the past to the actual reality of the DPRK. And these delegation trips are plays such an important role in cultivating the sense of connection and healthy sense of our ethnic identity among the diasporic Koreans. And the KEEP delegations have often included, like we mentioned, some bunch of queers, but also adoptees and some of the Chinese Koreans, Tompos. And we often consist these delegations in a very diverse way, not just big framework of Korean Americans, but within this framework, we have multiple ways of relating to our Korean identity. And when we come together and go to the DPRK with this diverse group together, we constantly create a new and reclaimed sense of Koreanness that is not just a sense of like dominant heteropatriarchal blood-based definition of Koreanness, but we continuously reinvent what it means to be Korean as we go and come back together and share our knowledge together. So one trip can do a lot in developing us as activists and organizers, and by reiterating and doing these multiple of these delegations and report backs and pre-study trip. Don't forget, we have to study beforehand. this is a, once again, reiterative and collective way of building knowledge together. So even if you yourself may not be going, if your comrade in your region are going, that contributes so much to the development of the Korean progressive radical community in your city as well. So it's a very much a translocal geographical element to it. As long as we think of this as a collective endeavor and not just individual development, we can continue to use these delegations and exposure trips as very strategic and effective method for building radical Korean communities all over the US together.
Yeah, and I think another value is sort of the stories I alluded to earlier, where we couldn't imagine a factory for whom automation didn't spell doom for a certain amount of workers, or renovating an apartment meant that the people living there would be kicked out. And I think like it's really important to go to places where we see, because there's a lot of talk here in the States of like, let's imagine something new, let's think of something new. But like, you know, there are people who are organizing society in different ways already that we can learn from. And I just wanted to point out that there's a common thought that you can't just talk to people in North Korea. So we were in the park, it's called Myohyang Park, and we ended up chatting with this grandma, and she taught us how to do dance, and she sang for us and all that stuff. And this was not an isolated incident, and you know, like, a cynical person would be like, oh, they planted this old lady in the park for no reason. So, you know, just like everyday experiences are possible, and they really help to broaden our understanding beyond what capitalism tells us is possible.
It's been such an honor to be in conversation with you both, such longstanding members of the organization. As we said in the beginning, Norodor was kind of founded based off of these KEEP delegations. We just have 10 more minutes for this workshop, so we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If you have a question, please go ahead and stand up and introduce your name, pronouns, and your question.
Hi, April, they, them pronouns. I have a question. I don't know if you guys have this experience, but I was wondering if you have any notable insights about what the relationship between North Korean communities around the border with China or Russia were like, and maybe what some of those insights might be like. And if you guys don't have any of that experience, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more between the relationship of rural communities and urban communities, because there's so much more population located in the rural areas. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of direct experience, because Pyongyang's sort of closer to the south and we travel everywhere by bus, we don't get to go to the border areas. I do know that, you know, I mentioned earlier, or Haruki mentioned earlier, that oftentimes there are adoptees on our trip. And so we usually meet with someone who had lost their parents in North Korea, and there's a lot of, in North Korea, when they had a bunch of war orphans after the Korean War, as many of you may know, South Korea created an industry to sell children abroad. But North Korea actually sent their children who had no longer had family because of the Korean War, to friendly socialist countries like in Russia and stuff like that. And so, and then they were called back after the war and after rebuilding happened. And I don't know if this directly answers your question, but it occurred to me because it sort of speaks to the relationship between different areas. And, you know, there is a strong, there are Korean communities in China, especially in the Yanbian region. Oh, I'm sorry, if I may say one more thing. In terms of the rural and urban, they definitely have a system to try to ensure like suitable healthcare, even if you are in a rural region. So they have like local hospitals, and then they have regional hospitals, and then they have people's hospitals, and then they have, you know, central hospitals like in Pyongyang. So like, you know, if something happens, you'll be scaled up to where you can be assisted depending on your need. So even if you are in a rural area with less healthcare, there is an infrastructure to facilitate access to, specialists if you do need.
Hi, I'm Sally, she, her pronouns. I just had a clarifying question about something you guys said in the, about like honorifics. So I'm curious if they don't use honorifics at all, or if it's all honorifics, and if, I guess if I interpreted your question correctly and there's just no honorifics at all, is there any other like element of like Confucianism that's left in the society? Like, do people bow? Like, what are some of the other like elements you've noticed?
So they're Korean. Sorry, I might have misspoke when I said no honorifics. They refer to each other as comrades, but they do speak to each other in 존댓말, and they usually say 씁니다 rather than yo, which is how it happens in South Korea. So it almost might sound more formal. I think this might be a story from Haejung, who was on our trip, one of the founding members of Nododo. Sorry, I don't mean to spotlight you. But I think I was told this story, and you can tell me if it's true or not later, but I was told that y'all were talking to your guides, and they were showing the guide was showing pictures of his wife, and you asked, what do you call your wife? In South Korea, you say like yobo or jagiya, or like you don't call them by their name, you have a little thing. And he said, oh, I call my wife comrade. I call my wife Suji. I'm sorry, Haruki, I'm taking over with all the stories. Please share.
Will you tell the story about the proposal too?
Yes, I will. I am speaking on a panel about North Korea, and I didn't want to cannibalize all my stories, so I wasn't going to share it. But I will share that in 2009, our guide was telling us also about his wife. As we travel from place to place, there's lots of sharing about our lives and building with each other. And so he was telling us how he met his wife and how they had to do their courtship on the phone and stuff because they lived in different areas. And then one of us asked, oh, how did you propose to her? And he said, oh, I said, will you walk this revolutionary road with me? And she said yes. And so I think those two relationship stories sort of demonstrate how the material relations of production in a society impact the social relations of how you engage with one another. And it's possible for us here too.
So I was sitting with some other young woman on the table, and then I asked her, what type of a husband do you want? Yeah, and all of them who are loyal to the country. There was like something who are just faithful to the country, and then commitment to the community. So it was not, totally, their answers were more broader love. It's broader love, not just me or my family, but something community and country. So they're desirable husband. So it was very interesting to hear that. And a lot of them were comrades before they got married. So at work or at different work sites in the community, so they were comrades first.
Hi, I'm Danielle, she, they. So you mentioned that it felt very safe at night, and obviously here in the States we spend a lot of our resources on police and prisons, which are violent. Could you speak to if you learned anything about how North Korean society, they respond to harm or violence in the community?
Yeah, actually in 2015, we visited with the public safety officers, of which the traffic controllers are like a branch. So it's like a more holistic version of like public safety and, like traffic safety, general safety. And we met with them, especially in 2015. This was in the wake of, a lot of the uprisings here, George Floyd, Mike Brown. And we felt we had built up enough goodwill with our hosts to request what might seem to be a sensitive topic in North Korea. And we ended up meeting with the the public safety officers. And they were very it's a very coveted position. You know, like a lot of people would like to do that job. Their vision of public safety is, again, as I said, more holistic. They try to care for people. It's not antagonistic as it is here. A slightly separate note, you know, when we go to the DMZ, we usually interact with soldiers there, and here, you know, the soldiers, sometimes there's like an antagonistic relationship. It's not quite comfortable, but when we were in the bus there with the soldiers, our guides were like very comfortable, and there was just a overall general sense of comfort. Another quick anecdote, which is before my time, they were a delegation, someone had fainted because of the heat and had to be taken to the hospital. And all the guides went with the person to the hospital, leaving the delegation participants by themselves, like to wander around in the park. So they were like wandering around, taking pictures, you know, having a great time. And this old man comes up and he's like, what are you doing? You're taking pictures, blah, blah, blah. And he like disappeared, and he went and grabbed a public safety officer and was like, these people are taking pictures, they're spying on us, etc. And the public safety officer was like, okay, like they were shown how to get back to their hotel, but the public safety officer wasn't like, I'm gonna, you know, before I went on my first trip, I got people telling me like, oh, I hope you can come back, like I hope you don't get imprisoned while you're there. And you know, like that interaction with like a public safety officer to me sort of shows that they're interested in like community and like and they're looking at the actual details of the situation and not just, you know, acting like the cops that we have here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.